Though I consider myself a diehard Sega fan, I was always quite fond of my Nintendo Entertainment System. I received it during the Christmas of 1986 quite early in its US run, and supported it well into the life of my Sega Genesis years later. It was this system that I credit with building my interest in console gaming to begin with, particularly after the latter years of the Atari 2600 had turned me off of the hobby. Its games were so different and the technology allowed for so much more on the screen and much deeper gameplay. Playing something like Super Mario Bros. For the first time was a revelation of just how much more a video game could be, how much more interaction you could have, and how much more there was to do. I mean, look at the early lineup, and as simple as those games may appear today, in 1986 they absolutely blew away my 11-year-old mind. With Sega's Master System performing so badly in my area, the NES was basically the system of choice there for quite some time. It seemed like every kid in school had one, and there was no shortage of games being traded and borrowed amongst my fellow classmates. That allowed all of us to play many games for the console, and it built the foundation of countless new friendships over the years. It was a special time in my life, and it's hard to fathom that it's been nearly 40 years since it all happened. To celebrate that time, I've put together an episode of Best Games just for the NES. The format is similar to before, just one runner-up and one winner for each category. No game can win more than once. This is purely for the fun of it and not a judgment of the choices you'd personally make. So sit back, relax, and celebrate with me the best of the best on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Our first category is the puzzle genre, one the NES saw plenty of releases in. Our runner-up is Dr. Mario, a falling block style game where you must eliminate viruses with light-colored pills. Match 4 colors together to clear the set. This was originally released in 1990 and hit multiple Nintendo platforms such as the Game Boy, NES, Super Nintendo, and even a few arcade varieties. It feels different enough from Tetris to hook you on this style of game again, and I always appreciated the solid audio and visual presentation. But when it comes to the best puzzler on the NES, it's gotta be Tetris. Seriously, at the time, was there a game that was as easy to pick up and play for just about anyone of any age? The concept was so simple. Lay blocks to make lines and stay away from the top of the screen. That was it, yet it was so addictive you just kept coming back for more. It's arguably better on the Game Boy because of its portability, but don't sleep on the NES edition. It's easily one of the very best games in the genre. Our runner-up sports game was a big one. Tecmo Bowl was the type of game that even if you didn't enjoy NFL games, you could still play this one due to its incredibly simple interface for play calling and quick strike scoring that made each game an exciting foot race to the end zone. The scoring cinematics were impressive, and who didn't love those classic sound effects? It didn't have an official NFL team license, but it did carry most of the popular players, and that made for one heck of a difference. It was based on an arcade game of the same name, but it played quite different, and would go on to spawn many sequels in the years to come. But as fun as this was, as accessible as it could be, no sports game came close to the raw playability and appeal of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! This one has everything. The graphics, the sound, the gameplay, the celebrity endorsement, the colorful characters, the puzzle elements, the challenge. I mean, pound for pound, it may well be one of the best designed games of all time. I don't think there was a kid in the 80s that didn't want to play Punch-Out!, boxing fan or not. Later releases stripped away the magic of facing down Kid Dynamite, but the original here was simply unforgettable. The NES had a few good light gun games, and Wild Gunman definitely deserves to be near the top of that list. Our runner-up had you in gunfights with bad guys to see who was the faster draw. Watch for the flash of the opponent's eyes and blast away. The quick draw showdowns were entertaining enough, but it was the gang option that was always the best. There you faced the bad guys at a saloon who would randomly appear and need to be shot down, increasing in difficulty with each level. A cool bit of trivia for this one is that Sega actually handled the US release of the original electromechanical version done in the 1970s. That version used live video projection for the visuals and was the basis for the NES update. When it comes to the best light gun title for the NES, the winner is Freedom Force by a mile, and it's not even close. This 1988 Sunsoft release has you as part of a counter-terrorism team out to save hostages in various locations. It's done shooting gallery style where terrorists pop out in the same areas as the hostages, so you need to be mindful of who you shoot. It's short but never ceases to be fun every single play session. It looks pretty good too. Our best racing category was fairly easy because both our choices were so good. Our runner-up is Super Off-Road, which was quite a bit different from most other racers at the time. This one puts the entire track on the screen with you racing miniature trucks around a dirt course. It was easy to pick up and the ability to buy upgrades and nitros was fairly novel at the time. The 4-player support doesn't hurt either. But when it comes to the best NES racing game, it has to be Micro Machines. This one showed up on the NES in 1991 and was immediately a massive hit. It uses an overhead perspective where you are looking down on everyday areas like a dining table, work desk, and bathtub. There were also many different vehicle types, ranging from boats, tanks, dune buggies, race cars, and even helicopters. This made for a really neat combination of feeling like you were playing with toys while playing a racing game. Believe it or not, this was not a licensed product by Nintendo, and the cartridge was not a standard-looking design. It didn't matter because Micro Machines was a standout racer at the time when most were knockoffs of one another or arcade ports that were mere shadows of their original greatness. The 2-player head-to-head mode was especially nice. One of the things that made the NES so special for me was the abundance of different game experiences I had never played before. At the time, I had thought the arcade experience was the be-all, end-all of the hobby, yet games like Metal Gear radically changed that perception. And that's our runner-up for Best Adventure Game. You went in as a secret agent trying to rescue a fellow member of your team and unravel the mystery of Outer Heaven's new secret weapon. Much of the time, you were hiding from enemies instead of killing them. Many areas were not immediately accessible, and you needed certain items and weapons to progress deeper into the narrative. It was so different from the stuff I had been playing that my 13-year-old mind could hardly deal with it all. I stuck with it, buried myself in the characters and story, and it ended up being one of the best times I ever had with a video game. And the same goes for our winner of this category, The Legend of Zelda, which itself was very similar in terms of core design. So much exploration, so many secrets and items to find, so many dungeons to explore. You start out with no predetermined path really, you can just kinda wander around and find different things to interact with. You start to find things you can buy, items like bombs that can reveal new pathways, and you earn new tools that really open the world up. Games like Metal Gear and Zelda changed what I expected from video games. I still love the simple joys of shooters, platformers, and beat-em-ups, but these games made me realize there could be so much more. I wish that I could tell you that I was a big fan of strategy games on the NES, but I honestly don't recall playing a single one back then. Nothing beyond something as simple as a chess game at least. Recently I have run across some pretty awesome games in the genre, so instead of doing the standard runner-up and winner format here, I'm going to just recommend you 2 games that I think you should play. First up is Famicom Wars, which now has an English translation and is often referred to as NES Wars. This one is a simple win by attrition affair where you must impose your will on the other team. Conquer cities for money and crush the enemy units until you either kill everything or capture their headquarters. The different unit types make for a fairly deep amount of strategy for a game this old. If it seems overwhelming, watch the computer play against itself. It really helps as a tutorial. I also recommend you look into a game called Daikaiju, Deberos. This was recently translated and is a strategy game that has you battling a giant Godzilla-style monster. The story has a huge egg falling to Earth and mankind trying to defend it from Deberos. As the egg is transported across Japan, the military must attack and slow down the kaiju before he destroys the egg. It's pretty tough, but the hilarious animations and cool cinematics make for a very different kind of game on the NES. I wish I could claim more expertise in this area for the console, but I just didn't go after these kinds of games much back then. Even if you are much more familiar with this genre, these two recommendations should give you something new to discover. While strategy games were not something I actively played on the NES, I did play a number of RPGs back then. I had a few friends who loved the genre, and I borrowed the stuff they'd buy after they finished it up. It was on the NES that I played our runner-up for the very first time, Final Fantasy. I thought it was so cool how you could name and build your party different each time you played. This was the quintessential JRPG, and was my first real exposure to it. Towns with vendors and inns to stay at, random battles, magic, and deeper narratives. As you may have surmised, it's basically a simplified version of the fantastic games that would appear on the Super Nintendo a few years later. It was easy to get into and quite a bit more accessible than many other early RPGs. Our winner of this category is Dragon Warrior 3, which was a bit more complex but equally as playable. The combat system kinda puts you in mind of the original Phantasy Star, where you only see the enemies you fight. The story is super simple to understand, and the ability to recruit your own team was again very nice. As you explore the world, you are essentially trying to complete a quest that your father failed. There's a day-night cycle, and the class system has an option to change the character after a certain level, which really gave you a ton of build options. The visuals are really the only thing this game didn't do well, but multiple remakes took care of that. No matter how you play this one, give it a try. It still holds up well, and was easily the very best of that series on the NES. Shoot 'em ups were aplenty on the old NES, but many of them were quite tame compared to what the genre morphed into on 16-bit consoles. Still, titles like our runner-up Gun-Knack were still great experiences. I love this one because of the wild option system that had both primary and secondary options that could be upgraded well above their standard variations. These options would rain death and destruction across the vertically scrolling screen on a scale few shooters could on the NES. It was developed by Compile and feels like it's start to finish. The US release changed the Japanese original quite a bit, which I highly recommend you play instead. It has the full cinematics and ending, making it a much more rewarding experience. The shooter I played the most and still consider the premier experience on the NES though, is Life Force, the easy winner of this category. Konami crafted an arcade port to be remembered here. Great graphics, impeccable sound, and a gameplay system that's easy to follow and implement. It's got huge bosses, pseudo-scaling effects, horizontal and vertically scrolling stages, and a two-player mode. There really is nothing else even close to it on the console in my opinion. It even supports the classic Konami code. In 1990, River City Ransom was released on the NES courtesy of Technos Japan, and it's an easy pick for the best runner-up in the beat-em-up category. Great graphics and sound punctuate a deep gameplay experience that allows you to travel the city at will, fight where you want, and purchase upgrades and services that empower your character. It has the typical save the girlfriend story, but those wacky enemy gangs and the sheer number of stuff you can do really elevate this one above the rank and file. And it would be the best beat 'em up on the NES if not for the pure arcade brilliance of Double Dragon 2. Technos was behind this one as well, and all my friends either had it or wanted it back in the day. Its popularity was absolute, and it made borrowing it quite easy because so many kids owned it. You may believe this was an arcade port, but it's quite different in design. New stages and changes to the enemies make it a largely unique experience. But the real hook here was the two-player mode. While the first NES Double Dragon was missing this in the main game, Double Dragon 2 has it, and it made a world of difference. This was back when a claim on the box meant you might actually get a good game, and this one was one of the best they ever published. The platform genre is no joke on the NES. In truth, a massive percentage of the library could fall into this one category. Our runner-up is the Capcom-developed Disney classic, DuckTales. This was as much an adventure game as it was a platformer, but it earns its place here with great visuals, sound, and the ability to tackle the various stages any way you want. There's secrets to find and even multiple endings. This is another one that could have been an easy choice for the winner, but that goes to the impeccable Batman the video game. Sunsoft crafted perhaps one of the very best licensed products that entire generation. It has an unforgettable soundtrack, the visuals capture the Dark Knight's world perfectly, and that wall-jumping, weapon-slinging gameplay has few equals in the genre. It's tough and forces you to be at your best, but I loved every minute of it. It's loosely based on the film with lots of additional locations and enemies, so it remains unique among the games based on the '89 movie. The NES was a beast in the genre with many great releases, but I still feel this is absolutely one of the best. Listening to the soundtrack sends waves of emotion over me and still resonates today. It's one of the better products to ever carry the Batman name. The best arcade port category must be approached with a measure of realism. I mean, the NES was a product of 1983, and its technology was not going to do one-to-one conversions. That doesn't mean there weren't some great ones, and our runner-up Jackal was certainly one of them. Based on the 1986 Konami coin-op, this one made its way to the NES 2 years later, and it nailed everything you loved about the original. It's got the two-player co-op, the POWs, and of course the power-ups. I'd even argue this is a better playing experience thanks to the horizontal orientation. It doesn't get the love it deserves, but my buddy and I played the heck out of it when it was released. Our winner was chosen because it did so well bringing the arcade's content home, and that's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. Yeah, the sound and visuals are heavily cut back, but it still has the two-player mode, the stages, the bosses, and the overall look and feel of its arcade big brother. But the best part is that it had content not in the coin-op, including more stages, enemies, and bosses. It has the 2 in the title because it followed the original NES release, and there was a third one that was pretty solid as well. The Nintendo Entertainment System had a way of taking some arcade games and just making them better, and this was certainly among the high points of those releases. When it comes to most underrated, I wanted to choose games that were really solid, yet tend to get very little love in the community at large. And I think our runner-up is a fine example of that, the 1989 release of Willow. Capcom decided against trying to port the arcade, so they instead made an action RPG that allowed you to explore, procure weapons, magic, and level up to be more effective. Much of the design is very Zelda-inspired, and it deviates from the movie in many ways, especially in the way you interact with other characters. It's a fun adventure, however, and is often overlooked by the NES fandom. Our winner for the most underrated on the NES is the criminally underappreciated, the Cryon Conquest. Vic Tokai took a lot of inspiration from the Mega Man games, and I dare say, may have made something even better. Welcome to a world where robots have taken over Earth and mankind has been utterly decimated. Their last hope is a magic-wielding witch that can ride brooms, freeze enemies, and use fire among her many talents. She can shoot vertically, use charged shots for more damage, and create shields to protect her from damage. There's so much gameplay variation here to jump into, and I really do feel this should be held in the same regard as Capcom's classic series. The difficulty can be a huge hurdle, but the reward is exceptional stuff. It's about as good as action platformers get on the NES. The best sequel category was filled to the brim with choices, but I think the improvements made in Mega Man 2 make it a worthy runner-up. The first game was tough as nails, and the sequel here added a number of improvements to alleviate that, including energy tanks to heal yourself, as well as a password system. Mega Man 2 also made improvements to the sound and visuals, and was one of the best looking and sounding games when it showed up in 1989. Capcom knew to leave the core experience alone, so it still has the great bosses, their weapons that give you an edge in battle, and the ability to play them in any order. This was a major improvement in just about every way and easily one of the better sequels on the NES. Our winner of this category had some big shoes to fill, seeing as how it had Mario on the box, but Super Mario Bros. 2 was special start to finish. Most of you know the story behind the scenes on this one. It began life as a game called Doki Doki Panic in Japan, but Nintendo wanted a different Super Mario 2 in the US because it felt the Japanese original was too samey and too difficult. They took Doki Doki Panic and reskinned it, added a few gameplay changes, and here you go. With 4 players of different traits, a massive world filled with secrets, and a design that is still unique in the Mario series, Super Mario Bros. 2 was a stunner. Most of the game's core mechanics were built around picking up things and throwing them. Veggies, blocks, bombs, and even enemies themselves. The amount of interaction here really made it feel different, and I think it was an excellent move for Nintendo to slap the Mario IP on it. It's easily my favorite sequel on the NES. The best exclusive category only really had one rule. It needed to be locked to the NES hardware and not released anywhere else. That made picking our runner-up an easy one, and that's Compile's The Guardian Legend. This is a mixed genre game that's part shoot 'em up, part top-down adventure, and part run-and-gun action game. It's very maze-like in its design, but once you get used to it, it's actually a very good game, and I am shocked it's never been remade. It was made at a time when most developers didn't tackle multiple genres at once like this, so my hat's off to the developers for trying and succeeding with such a well-made experience. The winner of the best exclusive is Tecmo's Rygar. While the arcade version of this game was ported to many platforms, the NES game was wholly unique in its design. This is an action-adventure with some light RPG elements, and it's among my favorite games for the console. I love the Metroid feel to the way you find items to progress deeper into the world. The sound and visuals were fantastic as well. It even had 2 forms of gameplay, a side-scroller and an overhead world. Essentially, you needed to kill enemies to gain power and life increases, and then explore to defeat bosses and gain tools to traverse the world more effectively. It made for one heck of an adventure. Be aware, the PAL release has a game-killing bug towards the end that makes winning almost impossible. Play the Japanese or US release for the best experience. The NES had an epic sound chip in it. You'd never have guessed it, but it was capable of some of the best tunes the gaming world has ever created. Our runner-up has never gotten the love it deserves, but it fits in right here perfectly. Castlevania 2 was the strange and unorthodox sequel to the popular original, now feeling much more like a Metroid title. Due to a botched translation, defeating this was tough without a strategy guide, But the one area the developers nailed was the music. No joke, this stuff sounds incredible on the NES. It's haunting and fits the material like a glove. Some of the best tracks in the series originated here, and it still sounds incredible today. Speaking of incredible, our best sound winner has no equal on the NES, and that's the first Ninja Gaiden. Those opening tunes still send shivers down my spine. This soundtrack is god tier, and there are honestly few 16-bit games that even challenge it. The variety was so impressive, and hard to believe this tiny cartridge could hold it all. It drove the action and made everything about this game better. It was energetic and dangerous, exactly what you needed for an adventure game about saving the world. I will leave you with a quick example of its absolute brilliance. A lot of folks, myself included, will tell you the Sega Master System was a more powerful console in terms of visuals. But when the NES was at its best, it was no slouch, and our runner-up is proof positive of that statement. Castlevania 3 was filled with great set pieces, dastardly enemies, menacing boss encounters, and all of it looked top-notch even in 1990. I love the way it used caves, old ruins, ghost ships, and clock towers to make every stage feel unique and part of the story. Enemy sprites were detailed and always looked threatening in their design, particularly the ones pulled from the books and movies that inspired them. It wasn't just a good-looking title either. Castlevania 3 was in consideration for many other categories in this very episode. The winner here is in a class by itself, however, and that's Batman: Return of the Joker. Great backgrounds, large sprites, and an overall design that makes the NES look like it might have been able to compete on a level close to the 16-bit machines. I always loved the little touches in the stages, like clouds moving in the sky, trees blowing in the wind, and water moving in the sewer. It was the stuff you saw in Genesis and Super Nintendo games every day, but not so much in 8-bit titles. It made Sunsoft's Return of the Joker something to see in 1991. Our final category is a big one, the best overall game on the NES. The runner-up was chosen because in terms of raw playability and fun factor, it's quite simply among the best, and that's Konami's Contra. Two-player co-op, aliens, massive boss battles, impeccable stage design, killer weapon system, and of course a cheat code for the ages. All these things made Contra a must-play in 1988, and one of the most popular games of its day. It's based on an arcade version of the same name, but the two couldn't have been more different. So much so, this is one of my very first lessons that a console game could be better than its arcade counterpart. And Contra on the NES was definitely that. It took run and guns and gave it an edge and coolness that slingshot the genre to one of the most popular on the console. It remains some of Konami's finest work, and one of the reasons the NES dominated the North American and Japanese markets. Beating this one was no easy thing. I needed something that was so strong in its design that it was culturally significant, and that choice was Super Mario Bros. 3. Nintendo had a special ability in making games that were accessible to everyone, and really, that is one of the reasons why Super Mario 3 was so big. Anyone could play it. Those opening worlds were so easy to just run around in and have fun, and there was so much to do. Mini-games galore, hidden stuff to find, and even world-skipping warps to uncover. It took what Nintendo had built the previous games on and gave it more personality, more variety, and more gameplay technique. The suits Mario could wear added powers that radically changed how you played. You could fly in a raccoon suit, swim faster in a frog outfit, throw hammers in a hammer suit, all while having access to the classic fireballs. Mario 3 is a classic that still resonates today, and it's been reissued countless times for the generations that followed. It ended Mario's mainline run on the NES with one heck of a bang. When Sega released the Genesis, I kept my NES for a few more years because the games kept on coming, and many of them were still quite impressive. Many of the best games released early started getting sequels that would refine the mechanics and presentation into some of the very best experiences you could find. Many years later, it was also cool to go back and see the titles I had missed, especially the Japanese Famicom library that I didn't have access to at the time. That opened up an entirely different catalog of releases that endeared me to the platform even more. So many games that were never localized for the US gave me renewed interest in the console, and I still fire it up every so often to play my favorites. Nintendo was also quite smart with the IPs it created during this time. You'll notice that most of the very best games Nintendo makes today were created during this era. Instead of looking for new characters, stories, and universes constantly, Nintendo chose to evolve its IPs over the years, tackling gameplay changes that made them feel new, fresh, and fun each and every time. This is something I really wish that Sega had done at the same level. Each new Sega console felt like it came from a different company, and they almost never put effort into seeing their properties improve drastically generation to generation. Nintendo's formula for success was to stay their own course, do their own thing, and make the best software they were capable of. Much of that started right here, and it makes the NES one hell of a special machine. There will never be another one like it. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.